Listeners, from time to time I get to step outside the norm on the Doctor Who show and chase down a bit of a passion topic or do an interview I'm genuinely interested in doing. The time I called Sophie Aldred on Skype remains a bucket list moment for me. And today is one of those times with a new Doctor Who reference book on the horizon, a new book that I've already pre-ordered, all about the creation of Doctor Who back in 1963. And I'm going to talk to its author, Paul Hayes, right now. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Hello, Rob. I'm very well, thank you. And thank you very much for having me on the show again. It's very kind of you and very nice to be back on.
Oh, brilliant. Yes, when we last had you on the show, it was for an episode of Primary Sources. But the time before that, you were on here to talk about your book, The Long Game, 1996 to 2003, the inside story of how the BBC brought back Doctor Who. Your first interview for it, actually.
It was, yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, you very kindly were the first ones on that one. And I felt very flattered and very honoured, as I do, to be on again to talk about this one. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, because today, dear listener, we'll be talking about a prequel of sorts to Paul's book. It's the new one, Pull to Open, 1962 to 63, the inside story of how the BBC created and launched Doctor Who. Paul, how did this come about? Were you thinking about doing this when you were writing the first book?
No, not at all. In fact, one of the reasons, as I think I wrote in the introduction to The Long Game, that I wrote that one was because it felt like an area of Doctor Who that hadn't really been explored in one narrative. As I mentioned at the time, there were lots of different places where you could find bits of that story, but I didn't feel there was anywhere that pulled it all together. Whereas, of course, with the creation of the show in 1963, even though it's something I've long been really fascinated by, and it's such a great story that I really love, and such an era and such a time in the BBC that I find fascinating, I felt that it had been well covered by other people. But then after The Long Game came out, and it did quite well, it got lots of nice comments from people, it sold a nice number of copies and all that sort of thing, and so it seemed as if that had gone really well. And I did an interview at the very end of 2021, when The Long Game had been out for a few months, with someone called AJ Black, who has his website where he talks about film and television. And the question he asked me at the end was, did I have any plans for another Doctor Who book or non-fiction book of any kind? And I didn't at that stage, and I just said, no, I can't imagine I'll write another non-fiction book. I don't really have an idea for one, but if I do, maybe I'll have another go. And it was New Year quite quickly after that, going into 2022. I was thinking about, what sort of things could I work on this year? And I kept thinking about what I'd said there. I didn't have any plans for another Doctor Who book. And I just kept thinking, it would almost be a waste to sort of, I've got this book published, it's gone well, people have liked it. There must be some way I can follow on from that and perhaps come up with something else that might get published and people might buy. And I started thinking again about the creation of the show, and there was another strand to this, in that in 2021 I'd had published in Doctor Who magazine an article about Donald Wilson, the co-creator of the show. And that it had been on the back burner there for a while. It eventually got published by them, but sadly by the time it got published there wasn't space for it to be as long as it originally had been. It had to be cut down quite a bit. So I had a lot of research and writing about Donald Wilson that hadn't made it into the magazine, and I thought, well, I could have a chapter about Donald Wilson in something, because I've got all this material that wasn't able to be used in DWM. Mm-hmm. But if you're writing a bit about the life of Donald Wilson, if that's one chapter, what's it one chapter of? And so eventually I sort of thought, well, there's the creation of the programme, and maybe I could do a book where that was covered in a way that it hadn't before, because I started to realise that all the other places where you read about the creation, almost all of them, it's the beginning of the story. It's the start of writing about season 1 or the Hartnell era or the 60s, or it's about the production of An Unearthly Child. There wasn't really a book, I felt, where the creation was the story. So I thought, what if I wrote a book that took it from that very first memo from Eric Maschwitz asking the script department about science fiction through to, well, originally I thought maybe through to the first transmission, but then I realised, no, it has to go up to the end of 1963, just because you get that whole kind of year's events quite nicely. And, of course, on the last Saturday in 1963, you get the Daleks sliding onto Britain's screens for the first time. And so a bit like The Long Game ended with the recommission of the show, and you get that happy ending, as it were. You get the same here, where it ends, where we know that the story then goes on to be Doctor Who conquering the world.
Yes, because I was thinking about this leading up to us speaking, and I thought, yes, while that first book was covering a topic that hadn't really been done properly in one place before, the birth of Doctor Who feels like something we all know and has appeared in a lot of places. So I thought, oh, well, maybe Paul's found some new material or material that wasn't widely known. But it sounds like just the angle of not doing just the birth of the show, but going back a year or so is the hook here.
Well, hopefully there are some new bits and pieces in it, and hopefully some bits and pieces that we previously thought that actually turn out to be wrong. Like, for instance, in a lot of places online, you'll find August 20th, 1963, given as the date when the first ever shooting of something new for the show took place for the titles. If you go back and look through the documentation, actually, that never happened. That August 20th session never happened. So there's bits and pieces like
so
that.
It's become folklore.
Yes, indeed, yeah. Toby Hadoke, who very kindly wrote the foreword for me, writes about how, you know, he loved that date because it was, I think, Sylvester McCoy's birthday, Sophie Aldred's birthday, Anthony Ainley's birthday, and so it's really disappointing that that's no longer the date when Doctor Who first had something shot for it. But it's also, as well, it's taking a similar approach to the long game, in the sense that in the long game, one of the things I really wanted to do was explain the wider background and context, not just that these things happened, but why they happened. So how these people got into those positions at that time, what was going on in the BBC at that time that meant that these certain things happened. And I've very much tried to do that with this one, with Pull to Open, to explain what was happening in the BBC at the time, and also explain a bit more about some of who these people were. Not just Donald Wilson, who's always been a figure who's particularly fascinated me, because he never seems to get the credit or the exposure that he deserves in comparison to Newman, but people who are normally just names on a list to us, people like Alice Frick and Eric Maschwitz and Donald Bull and John Braben, people who are normally just there as mentions at the start, just finding out a little bit more about who these people were and why they were doing those jobs.
Yeah, well, one of the aspects that stood out to me regarding that first book is how it really felt like a crash course in how the BBC worked at the time. And it sounds like this might have a similar air. You know, how different was the BBC of the early 60s to the 90s and the early noughts that you were covering in the first book?
Very different, I think, in a lot of ways. It's interesting that when the period The Long Game was covering, the whole kind of method of TV drama production in the UK had changed by then, and the old multi-camera studio method, shooting something in the same way that a chat show or a soap opera is shot these days, you know, with multi-cameras all being controlled from a gallery, you know, that had stopped really being used for drama in the UK, mostly by the sort of late 80s, early 90s, whereas in the early 60s, that was the way of making drama. You know, you made these things. It's a sort of changeover period, because live drama was just about sort of coming to an end as a regular thing. There were still some live dramas being made. There's a very famous police series in the UK called Z-Cars, for example, and the producer of that liked it being done live. He felt it gave the performances more pace and energy, and so that was done live right through to the end of its original run, I think, at the end of 1965. But mostly, drama was now being, even though it was being made in multi-camera studios still, as it had been when it was live, it was now being mostly made on tape. But there were restrictions. The Actors Union in Britain, Equity, was quite a powerful force at the time, and they were quite anti sort of pre-recording and recording out of sequence and things. So they had all kinds of rules and regulations in place about how much pre-shooting you could do and how much out of sequence shooting you could do and things. And also, there was this regulation that a pre-recorded program could not take more than 3 times its running order to shoot. So those early Doctor Who episodes, they have 75-minute recording sessions, because that was the maximum amount of time you were allowed to shoot them in on the Friday evening in the studio. On the other hand, though, that kind of as-liveness of early Doctor Who has sometimes been oversold a little bit, because right from the very beginning, right from the very start, there was always an editing session booked for the following Monday. So they would record. The way it worked is they would rehearse through the week like a stage play. So the actors, they would get their scripts, they would presumably learn them over the weekend or whenever beforehand. And on the Saturday for the first story, but Monday for most of the stories afterwards, they would go to... The BBC had no dedicated rehearsal space at the time, so they would go to church halls and Salvation Army centres and drill halls all over the place. And they would rehearse there through the week, Monday to Thursday, where the sets would be marked out and tape on the floor and all this kind of thing. So they'd rehearse it like a stage play. And then on the Friday, they would have their one day in the studio where through the morning, afternoon, through the day, they would rehearse with the sets and with the cameras and camera rehearse it, as it was called. And then in the evening, they had this 75-minute slot where they could get this 25-minute program recorded. But as I say, even though most of it would be done in those kind of long as live takes, there was always a bit more post-production going on than is sometimes supposed, and we know this because they had an editing session every Monday evening, but also there's some interesting memos that exist from the early days of the series from around November 63. There's one from Mervyn Pinfield, who was the associate producer on Doctor Who, sent to some of the directors, reminding them that they must specify which section of each episode they want film recorded to use as the recap next week, because they're doing retakes sometimes and it won't always be obvious which section is wanted. And there's also another memo from BBC Enterprises, who sold the shows overseas, complaining about how what they had wanted to do is, as I think most people know, to sell the shows overseas, they would be film recorded. So to put it basically, film camera pointing at a screen to make a copy on film, because it's much easier to sell overseas. It was much more durable and all those various things. So they would make film, and they didn't want to have to go through a generation of videotape to make these. They wanted just to do their film recordings straight from the studio sessions. And for the first few episodes, they tried doing this, making their film recordings straight from what was coming out of Lime Grove Studio D, not via the eventual videotape, if that makes sense. But There's a memo that exists from Enterprises complaining that it was impossible for them to to make these recordings usable because too much work was being done on the episodes afterwards. So right from the very start, even though a lot of the acting was being done in long rehearsed takes, there was a lot being done to the episode, more being done to the episodes afterwards, I think, than is sometimes supposed. So it was a sort of halfway house. Live drama had kind of gone out. It was still being made in the studios, multi-camera, like the live drama had been, but an increasing amount of post-production was starting to come in.
That's very interesting, because you do get the sense when watching the early Hartnell era that they are performing it like a play, and you think, well, that makes sense. These actors would be used to that. They'd be used to their rep theatre. They'd be used to maybe doing live stuff on TV. You can sense that someone is waiting in the wings on the set to do their line while people are talking in another part of the set. You can sense all that, but the thought that there was more editing going on, that's very interesting. What was something else that surprised you in writing the book, Paul? Maybe an anecdote you came across or a person you got to speak to for it? Because you've already blown me away with the editing thing. What was something else that surprised you?
I suppose one thing that really surprised me is I was fortunate enough, you may be aware of Graham Burke, who who edited Sidney Newman's memoirs for publication, and so it's a brilliant book that I highly recommend to everyone. Yes. And he was able to come across the correspondence between Malcolm Hulke and Sidney Newman when Malcolm Hulke was writing the first ever book about Doctor Who, The Making of Doctor Who, which was published in 1972. And Malcolm Hulke was really the first person ever to sort of go back from a historical perspective and try and work out who had created Doctor Who. And so he was researching this book in 1971, and he got in touch with Sidney Newman, Donald Wilson, Verity Lambert and David Whittaker. So he was the first sort of Doctor Who researcher, really, to try and find... And he was speaking to these people only 8 years after this had happened. So he was doing this research closer to the events than anyone else did. He got to speak to Newman, and he's the only... As far as I know, he's the only person who ever interviewed Donald Wilson about Doctor Who. It's really frustrating with Wilson in that... In 1991, he did a really detailed, in-depth interview, very long oral history interview about his life and career with for an oral history archive being put together by an organisation called BECTU, like a film industry trade union in the UK. And they were working with the British Film Institute doing oral history interviews with people about careers in film. And he did a very long, detailed interview, which the BFI holds and which I've been able to listen to. And they ask, and it's wonderful. And they go all the way through it. And it comes towards the end and you realise they're not going to ask him about Doctor Who. They're not going to ask him about Doctor Who. And they don't ask him about Doctor Who, and he doesn't bring it up. So as far as I know, the only interview that was ever done with Donald Wilson purely about Doctor Who was Malcolm Hulke's one in 1971. And Hulke did a phone interview with him. He tape recorded it. He had the tape recording typed up as a transcript. But the only bit of that we have is 2 pages that Hulk sent to Newman and which survived in Newman's papers and which Graham Burke found when he was researching for the published edition of Newman's memoirs. Oh. But in these 2 pages, Wilson talks about him and Newman creating Doctor Who. I mean, you'll know this if you've read Graham's book, but if you haven't read Graham's book, I'll save some of this because I don't want to spoil mine for people.
Sure.
It's interesting that, because the reason Hulk sends these 2 pages of the Wilson interview to Newman is because he's a bit worried that Newman has written to Hulk saying, it was all my idea, I created it was entirely mine. And Hulk sends these pages over saying, well, you've put me in a bit of a bind here, Sidney, because Donald says this. Hulk knew Newman. Hulk had written for Armchair Theatre when Newman was producing that, and he co-wrote the Pathfinders serials at ABC Television, which many people see as sort of precursors to Doctor Who. Mm-hmm. So Hulk and Newman had worked together quite a lot when Newman was in the UK. So Hulk was able to write to him and say, well, you've said this, Sidney, but Donald said this. And it's interesting that we all have this image of Newman as this man who fiercely protected his image as the creator of Doctor Who. So much so that I think we all know the story that in the 1980s, when the UK edition of Trivial Pursuit said that Toy Nation created the series, he absolutely hit the roof and wanted to take legal action against them. He even wrote to Toy Nation to get Toy Nation to send him a letter saying that he didn't create Doctor Who, so he could send it to the makers of Trivial Pursuit. So it's interesting that knowing that about Newman and knowing how much he was usually sort of protective of the idea that he'd created the show, it's interesting that when Wilson's claims are put to him, he's quite relaxed about it, and he says, "Oh yeah, maybe that is, maybe Donald maybe did do that, yeah." So that surprised me. Newman's fairly relaxed, although as he says to Hulk. In one of the letters, he says, Mac, I can afford to be relaxed about this because there's no money involved.
Wow. Yeah, look, it's like that sometimes when you're researching things. I was recently researching the Fifth Doctor's costume, and the guy who put that together did very few interviews about it. So the information on that, and that's something that happened in the 1980s, is fractured. So I can imagine what it's like going back to the 60s. I mean, I think that must be one of the profound differences with your first book.
Yes.
There just aren't as many people still alive who you can go to for a comment here.
No, it swings and roundabouts, because obviously there are a lot of new interviews I did for The Long Game, whereas for this... there's far fewer people still around to speak to. It's so frustrating about Wilson, because he lived until 2002, and according to his daughters, who I spoke to years ago when I was researching for the Doctor Who magazine piece, he was fully compos mentis till the end. So he was around until 2002 and in full possession of his faculties, and yet fandom never seems to have got hold of him. I remember talking to Stephen James Walker about this on an email, and he said that, I tried to interview Donald Wilson in the 80s, and I was told by the BBC that he was living in a retirement home in Scotland, which was completely untrue. So it's just such a shame that fandom, House Stammers Walker or whoever, never got, because I'm sure he would have spoken to them, and it would have been so useful, but sadly... that's ifs and ands now, but luckily, of course, many of the people involved have been interviewed down the years, and I'm able to quote from various sources. But yes, so it swings and roundabouts in the terms that there are far fewer new interviews. I was able to speak to Waris Hussein and Carol Ann Ford and Bernard Lodge, who did the titles, and Brian Hodgson I interviewed a few years ago for a radio programme, so I had an interview done with him. But so whereas on the minus side, there's fewer people I can do my own interviews with, so I'm reliant on a lot of other sources for quotes for interviews. On the plus side, of course, there's much more, I have access to the BBC internal documentation, the BBC Written Archive Centre at Caversham, which, of course, for The Long Game, I didn't have that privilege because it was obviously too recent to be able to get hold of any internal BBC material from that time. So, there's pluses and minuses on that.
Yeah, swings and roundabouts indeed. Are these early years of the show, the Hartnell era, essentially a favourite of yours, Paul?
I don't know if I always struggle with this question. I don't know if I have a favourite era particularly, but
Okay.
It is an era. It is one of the eras. I mean, I love all It's like Tom Spilsbury says, I love all Doctor Who, But I do find, certainly production-wise, I think the beginning of anything is fascinating, isn't it? If you're interested in television series or a film or anything really, if there's something that was created by a group of people coming together at a certain point in history, it's fascinating to see how and why those people came together at that time. That Eighth Doctor thing, that delicate thread of coincidences. It's fascinating to see how that came about and at the very beginning of something. And I think there is a great romance to that era, in the sense that on the one hand it's utterly ridiculous that they try to do all these extraordinary things in the confines of one rather knackered BBC studio in a multi-camera setup. And they didn't know that you can't do, the Space Year 5000 on 4 cameras at Lime Grove. It didn't occur to them that you couldn't do that, because that's just what television was, and it's what they're. I remember reading something Mark Gatiss wrote in Doctor Who magazine once. He said, well, continuity and canon is all very nice, but how wonderful must it have been to be David Whittaker and just open a submission that said the year is 3000, the Earth is underwater, or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, depending on how you answered that question was going to lead me into my next, and now I don't know quite how to couch it, because I can see pros and cons, whether you like or don't like the Hartnell era. I can see pros and cons there. On one side, you might really enjoy writing this book because you just bloody love the era. Or on the other side, maybe you could feel you could be more clinical about it, and a bit detached from it. But it sounds like you might be somewhere in between.
Well, hopefully, I think when you're writing a non-fiction book like that, I think the best non-fiction is written by people who have a passion for the subject. Obviously, you need a kind of, you don't want to, you need an academic detachment in some ways to make sure that what you're writing is as objective as it can be. But
yes.
On the other hand, I think with something like this, I think a passion for the subject really helps. And it's not just Doctor Who that interests me, but as I say, the BBC at that time fascinates me as well. And it's such an interesting period in British history as well, the kind of social and cultural background that was going on at the time. And it's the world of Profumo and Kennedy and the space race and the Beatles, and it's a very heady mix.
Do you go down? I know those are side streets you could go down and get lost completely in because they're huge topics, but do you go down any of those to any degree?
Well, I see. Yeah, there's bits and pieces because it is such a fascinating year, and we all know what it's building towards. Mm-hmm. You do drop in mentions of, like, for instance, around the. We don't know exactly what date Verity Lambert started at the BBC, but it was around the same point in June when Kennedy did his famous American University speech.
Right.
Our most basic common link. So you have to mention that, really, just because of what that means to Doctor Who as well. And the fact that there's the line, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future. And then there's a line after that, which is buried in the mix. It is there in remembrance, but it's buried in the mix. You don't really hear it, where he says, and we are all mortal. And, given what's coming up 5 months down the line, it's so there's bits and pieces like, and I do, just because I really love them, as I know you do as well. There are, along the way, we mention what's happening with the Beatles at any given point in time, here and there, and in particular dates things are going on. So, and I just think it helps build that atmosphere of, because it helps give a sense of where the world was and where the country was at that time as well. That world into which Doctor Who was born.
Absolutely. Oh, that's fascinating. I have 2 questions to wrap up. They're both cruel in different ways, Paul. Maybe the easier one first. Which of the 2 books was the hardest to write?
Ooh, what a question. I mean, I did enjoy doing both of them. I suppose.
I guess on one hand, you've got your first outing writing a Doctor Who non-fiction book with the first one. That would have been hard in itself. You've done it once now when you're writing the second one, but we've talked about some of the difficulties with the second one.
I suppose maybe I didn't think about either of them as being hard, but I suppose with the long game, as I mentioned, I was doing a lot more of my own interviewing and getting hold of a lot of people and persuading them to talk to me, which wasn't hard in itself in most cases, but it was certainly an extra task that I didn't have as much with Pull to Open. There was only really Waris, Carol, and Bernard, who I spoke to, new for this book. Whereas a lot of the obviously material comes from researching various archives, sort of newspaper archives online. And of course, I went back again to the BBC Written Archive Centre at Caversham, which is an absolutely wonderful place, and got a tremendous amount of help from them there with making this happen. So I'm very grateful to them. So yeah, I just enjoyed doing them both so much. So I don't think either of them was being hard, but I suppose there were maybe more tasks to do with the long game, just because there was so much more of tracking people down and persuading them to speak to me and things like that in terms of the new interviews.
All right. Well, based on that, and now onto the cruelest question, I realise this is the new book, and like a new car, it's got the new book smell. But which of the two books was your favourite?
Oh, well, I mean, again, it's tricky to say. I mean, but I enjoyed writing both of them. I really did. I suppose maybe this one, maybe Pulled to Open, purely because it is something that's fascinated me for so long. It is a story and a subject by which I've been fascinated ever since I was a little child. That it was fun to be able to sit down and have my go at telling the tale, and I just hope that other people enjoy reading it.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you've tapped into a part of the timeline that might not be mined, and that fascinates me. That I really want to read it. As you know, I've got a pre-order in myself.
It's very kind of you. Thank you. Yes.
Oh, no problem at all. I'm very keen to sort of think about this 1962 era myself, because so many of the books just sort of start in 63. Like, yeah, things are greenlit, they're making the show. It's a period you're tapping into here that I think may be untapped. Yeah,
well, I mean, obviously, those two, I mean, the 1962 bit is obviously mainly the two science fiction reports that were done. And obviously they don't sort of directly lead into Doctor Who, but they were clearly an influence because they're the earliest things you find in the Doctor Who files at the Written Archive Centre is those reports and the correspondence surrounding them, the two reports that were done by the script department. And then two of the people who were involved in those reports, Alice Frick and John Braben, they're in that very first meeting in Donald Wilson's office on March the 26th, 1963, a meeting that, of course, Sidney Newman wasn't even in. He tasked Donald Wilson with sort of setting this up and getting the ideas for it. And so yeah, Frick and Braben are in that meeting, and they'd done the second report. Frick had worked on both of them. So it's getting to write a bit more, and as I say, providing more context and background about who these people were. And things like, I found actually Alice Frick is very interesting. She'd had a long and successful career in Canadian radio drama. She'd been a major figure in trying to push women's rights at the CBC in Canada. For instance, when she was working there in the late 40s, the CBC decided to fire all married women on the basis that it was quote unquote unfair that in a harsh job market that married women should be working for them when they could be supported by their husbands.
Wow.
So she was one of the people who was instrumental in fighting back against that at the CBC. But also, there's a certain script that she read in 1956 that she made a decision about that means we're all still here today doing this, talking about Doctor Who, which I don't think would be happening if she hadn't made this decision about this script in 1956.
Interesting. I'm intrigued, Paul. I'm intrigued.
Oh, good.
Fantastic. Look, dear listener, Pulled to Open, 1962 to 63, the inside story of how the BBC created and launched Doctor Who. It's out on July 24th from 10 Acre Films. It's a paperback. It's 424 pages. And it's been my pleasure to talk to its author here, Paul Hayes. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us on The Doctor Who Show.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be on The Doctor Who Show, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.